And that's the end of the first half. As the teams head to the locker room, the Spartans lead the Bulldogs by a score.
You guys stink.
Geez, Coach, we're only down a couple of points.
No, I mean you guys really smell. You need to hit the showers. And here, I got every one of you new bars of soap from the Sterling Soap Company. Each bar is artisan crafted using natural ingredients and essential oils. They also have shave soaps, colognes, beard balm, and a whole lot more. Now get in there.
But Coach, we have another half to play.
I don't care. I can't stand to be around you.
A few minutes later.
All right, bring it in tight. You guys are still playing terrible, but you're smelling great out there. Now listen, you're going to need to stock up for the rest of the season. We got a lot of tough games left. So go to sterlingsoap.com after the game. That's STIRLING soap.com. You got that?
Yes, Coach.
Great. Sterlingsoap.com on 3. 1, 2, 3.
Sterlingsoap.com.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello, old sports, and welcome to another episode of the Hello, Old Sports podcast on the Sports History Network. I am Dan Newman. I'm joined, as always, by my brother and co-host, Andrew Newman. Andrew, how are you doing tonight?
I am doing well, Dan. I am we are in a very big heat wave for mid-April here as we're recording this. It was in the high 80s today. I was actually just walking around in shorts and a t-shirt for an hour or so before we recorded this. And I think it's not going to last too much longer, but it's a heat wave, and I'm ready to travel back to the carefree days of 1996.
This is, I was thinking about it a little bit as I was driving home tonight about these episodes that we do. And we've done quite a number of these so far. We've done 1920, 1941. We did 1950. What else have we done? 75, bunch in the 80s. We did 82, 84, 86. We did 1923, the first year Yankee Stadium opened. We did 98. I might be missing one or two. We generally tend to do them when there's some sort of an anniversary. So 20 years, 40 years, 75 years, 100 years, whatever type of thing. It's usually got to be some sort of a multiple of a 5 or a 0. And that's what brings us back tonight to 1936, which is 90 years ago. And nobody who does a sports podcast really has any sort of original ideas anymore, if we're being honest. But this is one of the things that we do that I think is pretty unique, where we actually travel back and do, a pretty thorough deep dive into the events of an entire calendar year in sports.
Yeah, I mean, to jump on what you said there, if we actually traveled back, it would be a very unique idea. I was thinking when one of our most recent episodes with the author who wrote the book about Jim Creighton, we have to be one of the only podcasts that talks about 19th century baseball sometimes. Like that's either what you do or it's not something you ever talk about. Like I would say there's very few that are between 5% and 95% of their episodes are about 1870s baseball.
Well, that was kind of what I was saying when we had him on. Is I was like, we do LeBron's Lakers, and what Anthony Davis tweeted after he got traded, and then we do Jim Creighton. So it's quite the mix here on Hello Old Sports, and tonight we're kind of right in the middle.
And there is some stuff in this year that look, obviously, when we do the eras, you can kind of go, all right, the years in the 20s are different than the years in the 50s versus the 80s or whatever, just because of the sports that are popular, the teams, whatever, the state of the league. There's some stuff in this specific year we're going to talk about where even if we were doing the year before or the year after, wouldn't come up. So that's why this was a very good selection by you for us to do the year 1936.
So this is another one of those situations where the audience knows something that we don't, because we don't know as we're starting to record this whether or not we are going to make one episode or two episodes. Just to kind of get a little bit of preview, we got baseball, and that is definitely going to be the anchor here, especially when you factor in the Negro Leagues, which is its own whole story or set of stories. You got an Olympics, and then, you got all the stuff we usually do. We'll touch on tennis, golf, auto racing, that type of thing. And then, boxing was kind of interesting in 1936. There were a few interesting things in boxing. There was an NHL. There was not yet an NBA, although there were some sort of ruminations of professional basketball. So I'm sorry.
That's not going to take long.
Famous last words. And then we got college sports, and we'll close. I think we have on the agenda. We're going to close with the NFL, if I remember correctly. So I guess anything else you'd like to add before we got started?
No, I'm ready to go.
Just a reminder to like, review, rate us, et cetera, et cetera. Email us, hellooldsports@gmail.com. All of that type of thing. So yeah, I guess we kind of want to start with baseball, right?
Before we jump too far into that, we like that there's fans. There needs to be boundaries. If I'm in the airport, if I'm late, don't come to my home. That should go without saying, but we've had experiences. So just, we need to respect our professional and personal boundaries.
I'm going to disagree with that. If anybody sees me or notices me and recognizes me from doing this podcast, please come up to me, no matter where I am or what I'm doing. So,
all right, we're going to start with baseball. You said, right?
Yeah. So we're going to start with the 1936 MLB season, and this is really sort of like we did 1923 a couple of years back. This is really sort of, in a lot of ways, the story of two New York teams. I have maybe a couple of things that I want to touch on at the end, but it's really sort of, it's the New York Yankees managed by Joe McCarthy and the New York Giants managed by Bill Terry, the player manager and first baseman. And the Giants had not been in the World Series in 3 years. They had made it in 1933, and they'd beaten Washington in the World Series. And the Yankees had not been in it for 4 years. They had been in it in 32. That was the year of Babe Ruth's famous called shot. And the last couple of years had been St. Louis and Detroit and the Cubs. But 36, you had the two big traditional powerhouse New York teams back in the World Series. And they were really, that was who, a Yankee won MVP of the American League, a Giant won MVP of the National League. And so it really was mostly about the Giants and the Yankees in 1936.
Yeah, and, sort of for context for overall baseball, this is the first baseball season without Babe Ruth. Now, 1935, he was with the Braves. He didn't play the whole season, but, he was involved in that baseball season. So this is sort of, the specter of the post-Babe Ruth era of baseball, exists there. And the two New York teams you mentioned, it's interesting because I was reading a book actually on this late 30s Yankees dynasty. There's several dynasties within the overall 40-year 23 to 64 Yankees dynasty. And coincidentally, 32 to 36 is the longest gap that they didn't win a pennant in that era, and they wouldn't go that long again until between 1964 and 1976, I believe. So, this Yankee team, probably of all of them to the modern history, this era is the one that's sort of the least remembered or at least sort of discussed, talked about, whatever. Obviously, some of that makes sense because everything after that was more recent than that. And obviously, when you get into the 50s with Mantle, and there's still a lot of people alive who remember Mantle, and even the late 40s teams. But this late 30s, Gehrig, DiMaggio, and I we'll obviously introduce DiMaggio into this story a little later, was a team that won 4 straight World Series and in a lot of ways was the most dominant team, even compared to, the Yankees of the late 40s, early 50s, whatever era you want. And then the Babe Ruth Yankees obviously have their own sort of special place in lore. So you have that team, and then you have the Giants, who in this same book, they talked about how, a lot of the history of the Giants in New York pre-1951 has really been sort of forgotten. But the most starring example of that is the 30s. To the extent that people talk about the baseball giants, they talk about, John McGraw, Christy Mathewson, maybe the teams in the early 20s. You do not hear very much about the Mel Ott, Carl Hubble 30s Giants anymore, even within the context of sports history.
Do you want to start off? Well, you want to do the Yankees first, maybe, and then we'll get into the Giants?
Sure, that's fine.
So I think the big thing here is that this was the rookie year of Joe DiMaggio. They had actually purchased him from the San Francisco Seals, which is a minor league team, basically like a AA level team. They had actually purchased him prior to the 1935 season, but part of the agreement was that he would spend one more year in San Francisco with the Seals, which he does. He has another incredible season with San Francisco. This is he hits 398. I think this is the year of his big minor league hitting streak. Just give me 1 second to look that up. He was 18 when he did this, so that would have been it would have been a couple years before. I think it was 1933 that he did this when he had a 61 game hitting streak for the Seals in the Pacific Coast League. But nonetheless, interesting thing about this Pacific Coast League is they were probably the only minor league in the whole country that played a longer season than the major leagues. They I'm trying to see if I can get their record here. I don't have it right in front of me, but DiMaggio plays 172 games for the San Francisco Seals in 1935. So that's 18 more than they're playing in Major League Baseball at the time. Hits 398, and then 1936 he joins the Yankees. He drives cross country with 2 fellow Italian Americans from the Bay Area, Tony Lazzari and Frank Crosetti. And the 2 famous stories are, first of all, nobody speaks for basically the whole drive. And at one point, Frank Crosetti clears his throat, and DiMaggio clears his throat, and Lazzari says, "What did he just say?" And Crosetti says, "He didn't say anything. Shut up." And so they continue to drive in silence for several more hours. At one point, they tell DiMaggio it's his turn to drive. He tells them he doesn't know how, and so then they're silent again for another several hours at a time. So 3 very stoic Italian-American players on the Yankees in the mid-1930s. DiMaggio misses the early season because he has a sore foot, and he places it in something called a diathermy machine, which in retrospect was probably... God, it didn't come through. Go ahead.
That was probably pumping him full of something poisonous.
Well, I don't know if it pumped in full of something poisonous. I just think it didn't work, and he severely burned his foot. And so he had to miss the beginning of the season. But this is the Yankees of the 30s. It had been Ruth's team, and it was about to become DiMaggio's team.
Yeah, so you look at some of these names, of sort of the starting lineup. Bill Dickey is still there. He's 29 years old. Lou Gehrig, who I'm sure we're going to talk more about, is still, Lou Gehrig's 33 years old. He's still putting up tremendous numbers. It's very hard to look at Gehrig, especially this era of Gehrig, without the hindsight of just how soon it was that his career and life would be over. But Lou Gehrig in 1936 is 33 years old. He's a strapping, guy still in his prime. He has another tremendous year of a 354 batting average and 49 home runs and 152 RBIs. Tony Lazzeri from the Murderers Row team is still there. Crucetti, like you mentioned. DiMaggio is going to slide into an outfield that's a little younger than the guys I just mentioned. There's a guy on the team named Bob Seeds, which is a funny name. And then the pitching, Red Ruffing, Lefty Gomez specifically as the two big names, Monty Pearson. It's a team that, hasn't won in a few years. They've been going through a bit of a transition, but is still really loaded with talent going into 36.
Yeah, and these are some of the guys that maybe you don't realize just how good they were. Lazzeri, who's coming to the end of his career but has a Hall of Fame career. Bill Dickey, the catcher, hits 362 in 1936. These are some really, really good players, but obviously the one you want to talk about the most is Gehrig. Gehrig had kind of started to come into his own as Ruth started to fade, and it's not necessarily the topic of our conversation tonight, but at some point in the 30s, the late 30s, the 33, 34 time period, Ruth is still a very good player, but he's not what he once was, and Gehrig is becoming an all-time great if he was not one before. 1934, which is Ruth's last year on the team, Yankees finish in second place behind the Tigers, but Gehrig, these are all tops in the league, and many of them are tops in baseball. 10.0 WAR, 49 home runs, 166 RBIs, 363 batting average. He wins the Triple Crown, but finishes this, and this is crazy, and this just shows you how insane MVP voting was at the time. Mickey Cochran is first. Charlie Gehringer is second, two members of the pennant-winning Tigers. Then his own teammate, Lefty Gomez, followed by Schoolboy Rowe, who's a Tigers pitcher, and then Gehrig. So you think it's bad that in 1942, Ted Williams wins the Triple Crown and finishes second in MVP voting. 1934, Lou Gehrig wins the Triple Crown and finishes fifth in American League MVP voting.
And then in 35, he doesn't win the Triple Crown, but he finishes fifth in MVP voting again. Needless to say, he's playing in every game. So these are all full season stats. 35, his average dips to 329. Now without Ruth, his walks shoot up to 132. He still has a 30 home run, 120 RBI season in 35. And that's, 120 is the lowest RBI total he's had yet. Like since 1926 is the last time he had that low of a number, and it's still, phenomenal. So again, it's easy to look and say really, within a couple of years he'd be making the speech, but this is still a guy who has not shown any signs of slowing down yet in his early 30s now.
Yeah, and there's a lot out there about Gehrig's sort of last few years and when exactly it was that he started to feel some of the effects, and the working knowledge is sort of in sometime in 1938, the effects of the ALS maybe really started to impact him. But 36 and 37, the guy's still just as good as he ever was. 354 and 351 batting averages, 130 and 127 RBIs. But sort of like it had with Ruth, he starts to get eclipsed by DiMaggio. Now, DiMaggio in personality, at least public personality, is probably a lot more similar to Gehrig than he is to Ruth. Quiet, reserved, not somebody who's going to be the life of the party, at least from a public point of view. But DiMaggio's fame sort of starts to eclipse Gehrig the same way Ruth's had. And this is what Lefty Gomez said. He said, Joe became the team's biggest star almost from the moment he hit the Yanks. It seemed a terrible shame for Lou. He didn't seem to care, but maybe he did. The relationship between Joe and Lou seemed pretty good. They never had a crossword that I heard of. They got along, but how could you ever know how Lou really felt? So, but again, and we've talked about Gehrig before, Gehrig, even if you put aside the streak, even if you put aside the fact that he played with Babe Ruth, even if you put aside the illness and the speech and all of those things, Lou Gehrig is probably one of the best 6 or 8 baseball players in history, and he's really proving it in these years post Ruth.
And these couple of years are interesting because this is the link in the chain that really gets talked the least about. So much has been talked about with the Ruth Gehrig relationship, and they were teammates for a very long time. And the DiMaggio mantle, even though it was only a year that they played together, and obviously DiMaggio was still around for the rest of Mantle's career, periodically, we don't hear a ton about DiMaggio and Gehrig, and obviously they were both much less outgoing than the guys on the other side of that chain. But I think the other one we should talk about probably is Joe McCarthy, because this is, very much the Joe McCarthy era for the Yankees, and very easily the Mount Rushmore of Yankee managers that everybody goes is Huggins, McCarthy, Stengel, Torre. I think is pretty much the answer there. And to be honest, if you have to split that in half, it's Stengel and McCarthy, and I don't know that McCarthy is number 2 there. That's a discussion for another time, but he's the manager from 1931 to 1946. So he's, right still in the first half of his tenure here, but he's right in the middle of his tenure. Up until this point, he's been the manager 5 years. They've only won 1 pennant and 1 World Series, which for the Yankees in that era is not good. A lot of his story is still to be written, but just a guy that I don't think it's talked about a ton in terms of his 15 or 16 years running the Yankees and style and his, relationship with his players. We know it was terrible with Ruth, but every manager's relationship was pretty terrible with Ruth.
And he's on the cusp here. He's about to win 4 World Series in a row, then have a year off, then win 41, get back there in 42, even though they lose, and then win again in 43 with a team essentially bereft of stars. He's about to win, 6 of the next 8 World Series, if I'm counting that correctly. So, yeah, and the departure of Ruth really enables this to become sort of the McCarthy team. This is a team of professionals, guys who are quiet and businesslike, and obviously not every guy fits into this this description every single day and every single game. But Dickey, Gehrig, DiMaggio, Ruffing, Gomez maybe had a little bit of a silly streak, but not the way some other guys would. Joe Gordon comes around in a couple years. Tommy Henrik is another really good example. These are serious, professional, all business, stoic type baseball players that fit the McCarthy mold once Ruth is no longer there.
And that might be also one of the reasons they're remembered a little less, or not even remembered, but discussed a little less, just because there's not as much personality there. He's got 10 commandments here, and to be honest, most of them aren't that interesting, for baseball, but I'll just read a few of them. Nobody ever became a ball player by walking after a ball. An outfielder who throws in back of a runner is locking the barn after the horse is stolen. When you start to slide, slide. He who changes his mind may have to change a good leg for a bad one. Just that kind of stuff. Very keep your head down, hustle, don't make excuses, don't try not to find too much fault with the umpires. You cannot expect them to be as perfect as you are.
My favorite one is number 6, or at least number 6 on my list. Do not alibi on bad hops. Anybody can field the good ones.
Fair enough. But yeah, so just a guy who's one of the most successful managers of all time. And sort of right in the middle of, or not right in the middle, really right at the beginning of this run you mentioned that by the time it's over is going to result in 7 world championships, 4 in a row. The other thing about that team from that era, they never lost the World Series, except for 1942, and that was a war year, and it was a much different thing. But when they got there, which was most years, they won it.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. That is exactly right. Whereas, Stengel lost, Stengel lost to Brooklyn. He lost to Milwaukee. He obviously lost to the Pirates, cost him his job. So, yeah, no, you're absolutely right. He only lost the one. And then in 43 is the really impressive year because other than Dickey, basically everybody else was gone in the military, and he still managed to win a World Series.
Mm-hmm.
Yankees win the pennant, sort of going away. They're 102-51. That's 19 and a half games ahead of the 83-71 defending champion Tigers. This was during that era where if one team won a bunch of games, it was going to be hard for any other team to win all that many because there was only 8 teams and they were just constantly playing each other 22 times. So the Yankees winning 102 games meant that it was going to be hard for anybody else to get all that close, and nobody really does. The Yankees clinch the AL pennant on September 9th, which is the earliest AL clinching ever to date.
Luke Appling with the White Sox wins the batting title at 388. Dickey's third, Gehrig is fifth. And this is the one I wanted to bring. The home run leader is Gehrig with 49. The RBI leader and the guy who's second in home runs with 42 is Hal Trusky.
First baseman for the Indians, right?
Yeah, and that's not a name I'm familiar with, really. This is really his best year. He finishes in the top 10 in MVP voting a couple of times. He's with the Indians, and then he comes back for a couple of years with the White Sox, like in the middle of the war, 44 and then 46. But just a guy who you look and you go, who is this guy that hit 162 RBI, had 162 RBIs that year on a Cleveland team that's not really a fairly nondescript Cleveland team, but had the year of his career.
The thing about Hal Trosky is that he never is able to make an all-star team because in front of him at first base in the American League in the 30s, you got Gehrig, you got Jimmy Fox, and you got Hank Greenberg. So, despite putting up 100 plus RBIs, something like 6 years in a row, home runs, 35, 26, 42, 32, MVP votes, all that type of thing. Hal Trosky never able to make it to an all-star team because he's got 3 all-time greats ahead of him blocking his way.
Anything else in the American League you wanted to talk about before we went over to the senior circuit?
Let's move over to the National League.
All right. So in the National League, we mentioned the Giants, and we'll talk about the Giants in a minute. They win the pennant by 5 games over the Cubs and Cardinals, respectively. They win. They're 92 and 62. So, not the 101 or 102 wins that the Yankees have, but still a real good record. The Giants were put in this position by winning. They won 15 games in a row that led them into first place. They went into first place on August 25th towards the end of that 15-game winning streak and didn't relinquish it for the rest of the year. We mentioned Chicago and St. Louis in second and third. Towards the bottom, you had Pittsburgh in fourth, the Reds 6 games under, the Boston Bees 12 games under, the Dodgers 67 and 87, and then the Phillies were 54 and 100.
So as we mentioned before, the MVP of the Giants, I'm sorry, the MVP, the manager of the Giants was Bill Terry, who was the 37-year-old player manager, first baseman, had been with the team since 1923, had taken over as manager from McGraw when McGraw resigned in 1932, and then he immediately leads the team to a world championship in 1933. He is done as a player after 1936. He hurts his knee during the 36th season and it is not able to come back, never really plays again. The owner of the Giants, who had been the owner going back, I don't know when exactly he bought the team, but Charles Stoneham, who let me see if I can just get real quick when he first he purchased the Giants in 1919. It also says that he
Is that from the guy who was the president of the National League or whatever his name was? What was his? Is that John Brush?
What? Yeah, he might have bought it from him. Yeah, I think that might be right. Brush.
Yeah.
It does say here on Wikipedia, and I've read this earlier, so that Horace Stoneham I'm sorry, Arnold Rothstein brokered Stoneham's purchase of the Giants, and I've heard that other places beyond just Wikipedia. But that's kind of 1919 is a great year to have Arnold Rothstein pulling the strings for you in Major League Baseball.
Yes.
The Giants' offense is not particularly impressive, other than Mel Ott, who leads the. He's 27. He's been with the Giants since 1926. He leads the team in home runs. I saw something the other day, and I don't remember the exact parameters of it, but Mel Ott led the Giants in home runs something like every year from 1927 to 1945. Maybe in a second I'll get the specifics of that.
I would hope it wasn't 1927 because he hit one home run.
Maybe I'm off a year.
This isn't whether they were the first or not, but I'll kind of read the numbers. Starting in 28, 18, 42, 25, 29, 38, 23, 35, 31, 33, 31, 36, 27, 19, 27, 30. And that's all the way till 1942. So that's conceivable. The year he hit 19. I mean, I guess if they were really bad or whatever, but
so here it is. 18 consecutive seasons from 28 to 45. No other player has ever led his team in more consecutive years in any Triple Crown category. So average, RBI, or home run. His 18 years is the top.
Yep. And he's, like you said, in 36, he came up when he was 17 years old in 1926. So he's been in the league for like 10 years, but he's still only in his mid to late 20s. He's 27 years old in 1936. He's still, the heart and soul of the Giants. He's won a championship. And he's, like you said, otherwise he kind of stands out in an otherwise unimpressive lineup. The only other name that really stands out to me from this, looking at these names is Travis Jackson, who was on those teams going back to the early 20s, the McGraw teams that played really just 23. He was only on the team at 22 for a year, for a couple of games, but who was on those, at least the end of those early 20s McGraw teams that played the Yankees 3 straight times in the World Series.
Yeah, and I don't know this is going way back to, 5.5 years ago now, but we either considered him or maybe even selected him as one of the infielders on our all-time New York National League team, and we did that in like episode 4 or 5. So his name has come up before.
Yep, and he was on the team from 20. This is actually his last year. He was on the team from 22 to 36. He's still he plays in 126 games, so most of the season for this Giant team. Some of the other names: Gus Mancuso is the catcher, Sam Leslie at first base, Burgess Whitehead at second base, Dick Bartell is the shortstop, Jackson at third, and then the other 2 outfielders along with JoJo Moore. It's along with Mel Ott is JoJo Moore, and then they have Hank Lieber listed as the third outfielder who played the most games. There's other Terry, like you mentioned, played in 79 games. Jimmy Ripple in the outfield. And then another interesting name as a reserve infielder at this point, winding down his career, is Mark Koenig, who had been on the Murderers Row Yankees, was with the Yankees from 25 to 30, spent some years with Detroit and Chicago and Cincinnati, and he's finishing up his career here with the 36 Giants.
Yeah, and Koenig is only 31 here, so I mean, he was. I never realized how young he was on the 27 Yankees. He would have only been 22 years of age on that 27 Yankees team. So yeah, that's another guy who was on the team.
And then from a pitching standpoint, it really starts and ends with Carl Hubbell. There were some guys who, one. Hal Schumacher was the number 2 starter. He went 11-13. Al Smith, who I believe was pulling double duty or had just finished up as being the mayor of New York City, or was he the governor of New York?
Al Smith was governor of New York. Yeah.
He was 14-13, and Freddie Fitzsimmons was 10-7. But Carl Hubbell, 26-6 with a 2.31 ERA. war, just to sort of illustrate this from a war standpoint, and I know there's, critics of war or whatever. The only other guys with positive wars from the pitching staff for the Giants was Schumacher with 1.1, Fitzsimmons with 1.8, and then a relief pitcher named Frank Gabler, who went, I probably wasn't a full, he started 14 games, but he was also pitched in relief. He went 9 and 8. He had a 2.5 WAR. Hubble's WAR was 9.7.
The sort of working theory, and I've seen this as a subtitle. There's a book that the author escapes me at the minute, but I've read or seen a biography of Carl Hubble, and it basically the theory of the book is that Carl Hubble is in the Hall of Fame on the basis of 5 dominant seasons, and from 33 to 37, he wins at least 21 games every single year. From 33 to 37, leads the league in ERA 3 times, including this year, like you said, with a 2.31 ERA. 1934 is when he has that famous moment in the second ever All-Star game where he strikes out Ruth, Gehrig, Fox. What's it? Gehringer, Ruth, Gehrig, Fox, Gehringer, and I'm blanking on who the 5th one is, but there is another one. It's Ruth, Gehrig, Fox, Gehringer, and I forget who the 5th Hall of Famer is, but maybe it's Al Simmons. He strikes out 5 Hall of Famers in a row in 1934. He is in the midst in this season between 36 and 37. He's in the midst of 24 consecutive wins without a loss, although he does take a loss in the 1936 World Series. Go ahead.
So it was Ruth, Gehrig, Fox, Al Simmons, and Joe Cronin.
Oh, it wasn't Gehringer. Okay. So he is right in the middle of the dominant. He wins MVP. There's no Cy Young. It won't be for another 20 years, but he wins MVP. The strength of the Giants in 36 and 37 when they get back to the World Series is clearly the pitching and even more clearly Carl Hubble.
Guy I know who people who know us would know that guy I've known for a very long time, did a radio show with for years, have known him, watched Giants games with him for years. He's a big Met fan, and his dad, who at best was a second generation, he was either first or second generation, like Italian immigrant, grew up in New York City, big Giants fan. And he used to skip school every time Carl Hubble pitched to go, like whenever Carl Hubble pitched at home, he would skip school to go watch Carl Hubble pitch. So just kind of, the phenomenon that he was back then for that couple of years in the 30s.
And if I can be self-referential here for a moment, when we did our New York athletes by number, Andrew pushed pretty hard for Carl Hubble at number 11 over Mark Messier and Phil Simms. We ended up going with Messier, but it's a good conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So anything else on the Giants you wanted to talk about?
No, but here's what I'm going to propose. Maybe we just kind of run through any other big stories in baseball, then we'll talk World Series, and then we'll get into the Negro Leagues.
Yeah, I think that's good.
The one thing that I had, other than the things we've already mentioned, well, 2 things, actually. First of all, 1936 was the first year of voting for the Baseball Hall of Fame. They didn't actually didn't do the first induction until 1939, but the voting started in 36, and they had one ballot for sort of modern day players, 20th century players, and then they had another ballot for 19th century players. Suffice it to say, nobody got in on the 19th century ballot, and it was kind of a mess because it wasn't clear how many votes, whether you should vote for 5 or 10, and some people voted for 10, and then they changed it to 5. So then they decided that for the votes that had come in where people had voted for 10, they would just count each of those votes as half a vote so they just sort of, nobody got elected from the 19th century and wouldn't for another couple of years. The regular ballot, the 20th century ballot, 5 guys get in, and it's hard to have more baseball royalty than this. And this is in order of percentage. It's Ty Cobb with 98.2, Babe Ruth 95.1, Hans Wagner with also 95.1, Chrissy Mathewson 90.7, Walter Johnson 83.6. But it was strange because nobody really knew exactly who you could and couldn't vote for. Active players got votes, and it was really just kind of very strange. But those big five guys were inducted, or at least elected into the Hall of Fame in 1936. Even though there wouldn't be inductions until 1939.
Mm-hmm.
And then the only other thing I would mention was that Mickey Cochran, who had managed the Tigers to the World Championship in 1935 and to the pennant in 1936, has his career ended as a player when he gets injured about a third of the way through the season, and then he suffers a nervous breakdown and I believe never manages again. No, actually, he comes back. I'm sorry, he comes back. He's replaced, and then he comes back again in 37, and all sorts of weird stuff. But 36 is sort of the beginning of the end for Mickey Cochran as both a player and a manager with the Detroit Tigers.
The All-Star game, because it was only the fourth one, so I figured it bears mentioning, was held in Boston, not at Fenway, but at National League Park, otherwise known as Braves Field.
Also known as the Boston University Soccer Field currently.
It wouldn't have been known as Braves Field in 1936 because that was during the brief era where the Braves had rebranded it as the Boston Bees. The NL won 4-2-3, it looks like, if I'm reading this correctly.
And I think 36 was when was that when Stengel? Oh no, Stengel wasn't the manager yet. Stengel doesn't take over till 38, I think. Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
And just one other thing I wanted to, because I don't know if we actually stated this when we talked about DiMaggio. DiMaggio ends up playing almost the whole season, 138 games. He finishes actually 8th in MVP voting. He hits 323 with 29 home runs and 125 RBIs. So just, a really, really good year for DiMaggio as a rookie.
Yeah, DiMaggio in the 30s and 40s before he goes into the military for the war is a dominant player. I think he hits like 390 one year. DiMaggio's gets remembered, I think, the streak he gets remembered for, but I think DiMaggio gets overrated by some people, but then I think historically he gets underrated a little bit too. People don't realize there was a period of 3 or 4 years in the 30s and early 40s where DiMaggio was playing baseball as well as anybody ever had before or since.
All right. Did you say before we did the World Series you wanted to do the Negro League? Or?
No, why don't we do the Negro Leagues after we do the 36 World Series?
All right. So 36 World Series, as one would imagine, would be, as we talked about, would be the Giants against the Yankees for the first time since they played 3 years in a row in the early 20s, 21, 22, 23. The Yankees playing, obviously, their first World Series in the post-Babe Ruth era. The Yankees end up winning the series in 6 games. Not a ton of wouldn't be one of the classic World Series. And you can stop me if there's something you want to say. The game 1 at the Polo Grounds, the Giants win 6-1. Carl Hubble pitches. He allows 1 run on 7 hits. Game 2, the Yankees destroy the Giants 18-4. They score 7 runs in the 3rd inning, 6 runs in the 9th inning. After that 7-run outpouring in the 3rd inning, it's really no kind of a game after that. DiMaggio makes a really nice catch in the 9th inning. Now again, it was 18-4. After DiMaggio's game-ending grab, President Roosevelt, who was in attendance, saluted Joe for his great catch. Yeah. Mm-hmm. He rode off the presidential limousine. All 3 ninth-inning outs were made by DiMaggio.
Mm-hmm.
I would say Roosevelt should have been out campaigning, but he did not have much to worry about.
Yeah, I think Alf Landon got 8 electoral votes.
We need to bring back guys running for president who were named Alf.
Well, there might be reasons why you don't get that anymore.
Of what it's short for. That'll come up later. Game 3, now we're at Yankee Stadium. The Yankees win 2-1. Bump Hadley gets the win. The Yankees only managed 4 hits over the course of the whole game, but they get a run in the 2nd. They get a run in the bottom of the 8th off a Frank Crosetti single. Game 4, the Yankees beat Carl Hubble 5-2, and take a commanding lead in the series. Gehrig homers, and the Yankees come to within one win of a championship.
Yeah, you can keep going. Then I just have a couple small points to make at the end.
Game 5 is a giant win in 10 innings and probably the best game of the series. Giants jump out up 3-0 early. It ends up tied after 6 innings at 3-3. In the 10th inning, Terry hits a sacrifice fly, gets the run in. They end up winning, holding off elimination. Series shifts back to the Polo grounds, and much like Game 2, it's another blowout. The Yankees score. I mean, I guess it wasn't a blowout until the end. It was actually tied at 5 it was 5-4 after 7 innings. It was 6-5 after 8 innings, and then the Yankees scored 7 runs in the top of the 9th and won 13-5. So it was close until the very end.
So just a couple of quick things here. First of all, the loss in Game 1 brought to an end a streak of 12 consecutive Yankee victories in World Series games. They had swept the World Series in 27, 28, and 32 for 12 consecutive game wins without a loss. That record would be tied by the Yankees and then broken by the Yankees when they won 4 in a row in 96 in games 3 through 6, 4 in a row in 98, 4 in a row in 99, both sweeps. And then they won games 1 and 2 of the Subway Series against the Mets in 2000 to make it 14 in a row. So that was the record that the Yankees broke in Game 1 of 2000. Was that record that they had held from 27, 28, and 32. Carl Hubbell's loss in Game 4 of this series is the one that interrupts that winning streak that I talked about, but it doesn't officially count. So when the 37 season starts, he's able to continue on that streak and eventually run it up to 24. And then the only other thing I was going to mention is that there's an author, a New York Times baseball writer by the name of Tyler Kepner, who wrote a book about the history of the World Series a couple of years back called The Grandest Stage. And one of the things that he does is he looks back at all of the World Series before the 1950s when they started officially naming MVPs of the World Series. And he names a retroactive MVP for every World Series going back to the very beginning. Usually it's names that you know, a lot of Ruth, Gehrig, DiMaggio, that type of thing. For 1936, he gives it to a guy named Jake Powell, who's an outfielder for the Yankees. Hits 455 in the series, and I believe Powell gets the game-winning hit in one of these games. All right, so I'm not seeing if he might have had a game-winning hit or something, but anyway, he hits 455 in the series, and that's the impetus for Tyler Kepner naming him the retroactive MVP. Jake Powell is a guy who had a little bit of a checkered life, let's say. There's a lot of negatives in his life that maybe we don't have to dwell on, but look it up.
Yeah, and the thing that I didn't know until his famous very bad quote about what he did in the off season as a police officer. He wasn't even a police officer. So,
well, do you know the other story about him though that has nothing to do with that?
I don't know if I do.
He got arrested for passing bad checks and killed himself in a DC police station.
Oh, I didn't know that's how it ended. Okay.
Yeah. So that
individual. Congratulations, the MVP of the World Series. Presumably came long after you were dead and everybody forgot about you. All right. Talk about the Negro Leagues now.
Yeah, let's talk Negro Leagues. So those not overly familiar with the Negro Leagues might not realize that it was a series of leagues throughout the year that are now considered to have been major leagues, starting with the Negro National League. And then for the couple of years in the 20s, there was the Eastern Colored League. And then there was another version of the Negro National League. And later there was the Negro American League and maybe even one or two others. 1936, it's just the Negro National League. So when we're talking about the Negro Leagues in 1936, we're talking about just the Negro National League, and that's made up of 7 teams: the Pittsburgh Crawfords, the New York Black Yankees, the Homestead Grays, who are also based in Pittsburgh, Newark Eagles, it's Newark, New Jersey, Washington Elite Giants, the New York Cubans, and the Philadelphia Stars. And the champions this year are the Pittsburgh Crawfords, who and some of these stats are obviously, they're a little bit, not complete, but the Pittsburgh Crawfords of 1936 are one of the great teams in the history of any baseball, but certainly in the history of black baseball, the Negro Leagues. 48-33 record, which is first in the Negro National League. They are managed by Oscar Charleston, the great Oscar Charleston, a great, player who still plays some, even at age 39. But they also have Josh Gibson, who hits 18 home runs with 66 RBIs and a 389 average in 50 games. That's a triple crown. They've got Judy Johnson, Hall of Fame third baseman, Cool Papa Bell, the great base stealer and speedster of the Negro Leagues. And pitching, they have 2 future Hall of Famers. They have Bill Foster, the brother of Rube Foster, who was the founder of the Negro Leagues, 15 years or so earlier. And then they have the great Satchel Paige. So and I would argue that with Gibson, Bell, Charleston, and Page, and I'm not a Negro League historian necessarily by any means, but those are probably the 4 best players in the history of Negro League baseball, and they're all playing on one team in 1936 for the Crawfords.
Yeah. It's, obviously Page and Gibson are the 2 that most people, if they know very little about Negro League baseball, that's still the 2 names that they know. And this looks like, again, like you said, it's hard to piece together, but it seems like one of Gibson's best years in 1936 in that era. It's unfortunate that so much of the history it's unfortunate for a number of reasons, but it does make it, a little difficult to sort of talk about or quantify exactly, the numbers, because we don't know everything that we would know for white baseball, really. But you're right. When you just list off the names, anybody who knows is like, wow, that's a dominant team in that era.
From what I could find, they played a split season in 1936, but I think they won both sides of the split season. But then they ended up starting a series against the Newark Eagles. Is that what this is? Yeah, they ended up starting a season against the Newark Eagles. But several of the Crawfords players had sort of abandoned the team by that point, so they lose that series. At least they also, and then they later play a game against they then later play some games against the Washington Elite Giants. So this again, it's very sort of it's very sort of disjointed. But the fact of the matter is that the 1936 Pittsburgh Crawfords represent one of the greatest single season collections of talent in the history of baseball, with all of those Hall of Famers, and particularly those 4 guys that I mentioned. And everybody was expecting that dominance to continue for a very long time. But then Gibson and Page and Bell and some others are recruited by the president of the Dominican Republic, a guy by the name of Trujillo, to play on his Dragones de Ciudad Trujillo team in the Dominican League in 1937. They're on the dictator's team, which is a crazy story in and of itself, but that leads many of them to abandon the Crawfords, so they are not the team in 1937 that they had been in 1936. Just another couple other things to mention. A pitcher by the name of Leroy Matlock for the Crawfords is in the midst of a 26-game winning streak. It must come to an end this year because he does have losses in this. He has 10-3 on the season. So that 26-game winning streak, I think, comes to an end in the 1936 season. I can actually verify that real quick. Yeah, because he was He was 8-0 in 35, and well, again, different stats are in different places. But yeah, another dominant pitcher, not a Hall of Famer, but Leroy Matlock putting together a nice stretch of wins for himself in 1936. And then the only other note I have is that there were 30,000 people at the annual Negro League All-Star Game, the East-West Game in 1936,
which was generally the biggest deal.
Yeah.
Baseball.
As we just mentioned, it was hard sometimes for these postseason series to keep the rosters together.
One other baseball related thing I did want to mention, 1936 is generally recognized as the first year of major professional baseball in Japan. The league that started play in 1936 was known as the Japanese Baseball League, which operated from 1936 to 1949 before reorganizing in 1950 as, I believe it's pronounced Nippon, but the professional league that exists to this day, NIPPON. So there was a pause. Obviously, Japanese history in the late 30s and 40s gets a little complicated, but it seems like they pretty much played every year except for 1945. So, a not insignificant thing for the country that's, had the highest level professional baseball, except for the United States for generations now.
And before we leave baseball, I wanted to just go back to something that I wanted to mention with the going out of the World Series. And this is a book. It's actually the book is about the New York Giants, but it's a quote about the Yankees. It says, then this is referring to Jake Powell. It said that the Yankees had begun one of their traditions, which is getting a key season or half season out of unexpected players. It was a mold into which such names as Enos Slaughter, George McQuinn, Nick Etten, Johnny Sane, Luis Arroyo, Bob Turley, and even Bobby Shantz would fit neatly in the picture. This book was written in the 80s, but I just kind of made note of that because that was kind of a hallmark in a lot of ways of the Yankees of the 90s, was getting good performances for a very brief period, especially by position players, by guy, whether it was Cecil Fielder or Charlie Hayes or Shane Spencer going on a crazy run in 1998 in September. So I just thought that was kind of fit. I mean, Aaron Boone in 2003, I just thought that was fitting because that remained a Yankee theme going up until the very end. What were you going to say?
Saying that was one at bats too. Aaron
yeah,
Boone
that's a good point.
Wasn't even that wasn't even a whole thing. But yeah, you're right.
So that was baseball in 1936. And I think next we're going to talk a little bit about basketball and hockey, such as it was.
Yeah, which one do you want to start with?
Why don't we do hockey first?
Okay, so it's the 19th season of the NHL. It is there's 8 teams in the league. The St. Louis Eagles had dropped out before the season began. And I think they had only been around for a couple of years. Oh no, actually, never mind. That was the St. Louis Eagles were the team that was the Ottawa Senators going back to the 1880s. They moved to St. Louis. They played 1 year in St. Louis as the St. Louis Eagles, and then they folded. So we're at the quote unquote original 6, which is the Rangers, Bruins, Blackhawks, Red Wings, Maple Leafs, and Montreal Canadiens. And then you have 2 other teams, both in existing markets. You have the Montreal Maroons and the New York Americans are your 8 teams in the NHL in this season. The New York Americans were also teetering on the edge of solvency and existing, but that was your league. It was broken into 2 divisions. It was the Red Wings, Bruins, Blackhawks, and New York Rangers in the American division, and then the Montreal Maple Leafs, or the Maroons, Maple Leafs, Canadians, and New York Americans in the Canadian division, just to let you know where they stood in the
exactly.
When you consider that every other team plays closer to Canada than they do, Detroit especially.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But I think the Rangers probably had a little sway over that. The Stanley Cup was the Red Wings over the Maple Leafs in the Stanley Cup Finals. They won that series 3-1. This is an interesting thing that they did in that I think 6 of the 8 teams made the playoffs, but they did something where the first round, Toronto played Boston and the New York Americans played Chicago. And they played a 2-game series. And
was this like the best goals thing?
Whoever scored the most goals, which I mean, I guess is also goal differential because, it's going to be the same thing. But like whoever scored the most goals won the series. So it was really just one long game. Like,
that's a good
if
point.
You think of it,
yeah, why not just play one game at that point?
Yeah. So that was that. The Detroit beat Montreal. Toronto beat the New York Americans in the semifinals, and then it was Detroit over Toronto in the Stanley Cup Finals. Eddie Shore of the Bruins won the MVP. It was his 3rd of 4. I think he was winning a couple. I think he had won it the year before as well. Let me see. He won the MVP in what years did he? He won the MVP in 33, 35, 36, and 38. So this was his 3rd of 4, and it was his 2nd consecutive MVP. The rookie of the year was Mike Caracas from Chicago.
Now, is that, you may not have that, but was that a retroactive rookie of the year? Or was that named at the time? Because I always thought that the idea of a rookie in the year in sports didn't come until Jackie Robinson in 47. But you're saying that hockey was doing them over 10 years earlier.
Calder Memorial Trophy is named to honor Frank Calder, the former president of the NHL from his inception. Although Rookie of the Year honors were handed out beginning in 32-33, the Calder Trophy was first presented at the conclusion of the 36-37 season. So this would have been the last year before that. So I guess they did do a Rookie of the Year.
I just have a couple things maybe to kind of go through here, and just bear with me while I pull up. So the you mentioned the Red Wings were the champions of the league. This is how an author, a guy who's a well-known hockey writer by the name of Brian McFarlane, said Detroit, which could draw thousands of Canadian hockey fans from across the river, had become a hockey hotspot. Jack Adams reached far and wide for players to build a strong club. There was Normie Smith in goal, the Kilrea brothers from Ottawa, Sid Howe and Marty Barry, and a brilliant rookie from Sudbury, Larry Ory, on the forward line, and a hard-hitting defenseman, Bucko McDonald, on the defense. So that was the Red Wings. Their very first playoff game is against the aforementioned Montreal Maroons, and they win that game 1-0 in 6 overtimes, which I think might still be the longest playoff game in NHL history, but 6 overtimes.
I know there's other ones that have gone 6. I don't know if there's ones that have gone longer than that. I'll check. But I should also mention that this was the Red Wings' first Stanley Cup. So you think about the teams that, have gone, the teams that have, the Red Wings as this like seminal franchise. And this was kind of where it started for them in terms of winning championships.
A couple other things just to mention. You mentioned that Eddie Shore was the MVP of the Bruins. This is the first year that the Bruins wear their famous black and gold. I don't know what specifically they were wearing before that, but this was the first year of that. Say again?
I think it was just brown and gold.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I think I've seen that, pictures of that. This is what the curator of the Boston Sports Museum once had to say. He said he described Shore as the Babe Ruth and the Ty Cobb of hockey. He had the skill and charisma that made you never want to take your eyes off of him, but he also had a competitive ferocity that created this aura of imminent dread and contention that was always present. And in fact, a few years earlier, he had hit a Toronto Maple Leafs player by the name of Ace Bailey and hospitalized the guy and effectively ended his career. And there'd been calls to ban Eddie Shore for life from hockey and all this bad blood. And then the two finally shook hands at center ice at a charity game. And it was like this, weight was lifted off of the hockey world. But Eddie Shore, probably the biggest star of the pre-war NHL, but also one of the most reviled players by the other teams, the other players, the other city. In fact, in 36, he's playing with a guy by the name of Babe Siebert, who's another all-star. And Babe Siebert had come over from let me look up and see where Babe Siebert had come up from. It might have even been from that same Montreal Maroons team. Babe Siebert had played with the Montreal Maroons and then a couple years with the Rangers. And even though he's playing with Eddie Shore and their teammates, they refuse to speak to each other because of the bad blood. And then the only other thing I wanted to mention was that this was the year that the Montreal Maroons traded Toe Blake to the Montreal Canadiens, and Toe Blake ended up being not only a star player with the Canadiens and played with Rocket Richard in Richard's early days, but Blake then was the legendary coach of the Montreal Maroons and won, good God, he won 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 Stanley Cups as the coach of the Canadiens. So he ends up joining the team for the 35-36 season and not leaving the Montreal Canadiens until 1968, going out as a Stanley Cup winner. So a long and illustrious career in the Canadiens franchise for Toe Blake, and it begins with that trade in the 35-36 season.
So I looked up NHL playoff games. That's the longest game. 5 games ever have gone to 6 overtimes. The Ducks at the Stars in 2003 ended 48 seconds into the second overtime, or into the 6th overtime. The Blue Jackets at the Lightning in August of 2020 went to 10 minutes into the 6th overtime, which that had to be weird.
With nobody there.
Empty arena playing 6 overtimes in mid-August.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say. When was it even?
2000 was Philly and Pittsburgh, went to about 12 minutes into the 6th overtime. The second longest game ever went 14 minutes and 46 seconds into the 6th overtime. It was actually before this one. It was the Bruins at the Maple Leafs, April 3rd, 1933. And then this game was actually 16 minutes and 30 seconds. So it was getting close to the end of overtime when Detroit scored their only goal to beat Montreal, the Montreal Maroons.
And there was no real, from what I can see, there was no real college hockey to speak of in the 1930s. So there's nothing really to speak of there. So
lists that Minnesota won the West, and for who won the East, it said Clarkson/Harvard. And based on the records there, it seems like it's too primitive to really discuss. So,
all right, so that's hockey, and maybe now we should turn to the other winter sport, such as it is.
Yeah, so basketball, obviously we're still more than a decade until the beginnings of the NBA, BAA, whatever you'd like to call it. The NBL doesn't even really exist yet. The next year, the Midwest Basketball Conference would become the NBL. You had the ABL, which had been a major league, according to this, until 1931. I guess now they, and this is one of those sort of like retroactive classifications, but in 1936 in the championship series, the Philadelphia Spas beat the Brooklyn Visitations 4-3. That's really what I have. What else do you have?
So this was the first year of the Midwest Basketball Conference from 1935 to 1936, and it plays this year and the following year as the Midwest Basketball Conference, and then in 37, 38 it becomes the NBL. And then in the mid 40s, the NBL merges with the BAA and becomes the ABA, or the NBA rather. So while it is certainly tenuous to say this, in some ways, the 1936 season, the 1935-36 season can be considered the first year of the forerunner of the NBA. And this is the team that consists of, here are the teams, and I always love doing this.
I think I know why. Go ahead.
Well, no, the Red Man Tobaccos are not on this team, but in the East Division, we have the Akron Firestone Non-Skids, the Pittsburgh YMHA, which I don't know what that stands for, the Buffalo Bisons, the Dayton Metropolitans, and then in the West we have the Indianapolis Koutskis, the Chicago Duffy Florals, the Detroit Head Aids, the Indianapolis US Tires, and the Windsor, Ontario Cooper Buses.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I saw is that, as is always the case with these leagues early on, teams are responsible for their own scheduling. Everything is sort of hit and miss. One of the players says, I was just having fun playing some basketball. The games were played mostly on Sundays. I was just having fun playing basketball. I had no idea we were even in a league. So... and then there was just one more thing I wanted to look up here.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at the Pro Basketball Encyclopedia. They talk about a league called the American Basketball League. It says was anchored by stable franchises in Brooklyn, Jersey, New York, and Philadelphia. The Kingston team, which is Kingston, New York, that had won the New York State League, replaced the weak Boston franchise. And then the New Britain franchise, which was New Britain, Connecticut, I'm sure, transferred to his hometown of Paterson, New Jersey. So, there's obviously lots of all of these little leagues.
The Chicago team upsets Akron in the playoff semifinals. I'm sorry, Chicago upsets Akron in Akron is upset by Chicago in the semifinals, and then Chicago defeats the Indianapolis. Is it Indianapolis? The Indianapolis Koutskis in the finals to win the championship for the first year of the Midwest Basketball Conference. One of the interesting things, one of the players who is a runner-up on the Indianapolis Couts, one of the players who is on the runner-up Indianapolis Koutskis is a guy whose name would come up from time to time again in the history of basketball, John Wooden.
Yes.
And then I guess really quickly on college basketball, there was no NCAA tournament yet. That was didn't come along. Actually, not that long from now, not till 1939, a few years later. We've talked a little bit about this Helms Foundation that has awarded retroactive championships and players of the year. They gave both to Notre Dame and to John Moore, Moir, who is a player for Notre Dame. So at least as far as the Helms Foundation is concerned, the Notre Dame and their star player John Moore are firmly in charge of the 1936 NCAA basketball season.
And we should point out that was named in like 1943. So it wasn't like it was named in 2017. Like at least there's some, it's not contemporaneous, but it's relatively close. The only other thing I look up when it's ever a really old season like this is to see how LaSalle did, and they went 4-13. So they had some fine seasons coming up, but this was still very early for them.
Yeah, and I want to see, when did the NIT start? The NIT started in 38, so the year before the NCAA. So there was no NIT either. But I did see that, just kind of locally for Andrew and I, the Long Island University team, the LIU Blackbirds, are in the midst of a 43-game winning streak. They are 25-0 in the 1935-36 season. They are coached by a gentleman by the name of Claire B., who would be around quite a while in college basketball. He's a member of both the College Basketball Hall of Fame and the Naismith Hall of Fame. Actually wins the first two NIT tournaments, I should say, in 1939 and 1941, and coaches basketball for LIU. This is the LIU Brooklyn is how they're delineated at this point. And then from 52 to 54, he actually coaches the Baltimore Bullets in the NBA. So not somebody who we would consider a basketball powerhouse in this day and age, but the LIU Blackbirds in the midst of a 43-game winning streak in the 35-36 season.
And they make it occasionally now as a 16 seed. They may be.
All right, so I think now it's time to maybe talk about some other sort of individual sports, sort of odds and ends type of thing. I don't know where you wanted to start, but maybe I'll turn it over to you to start it off.
All right, I guess we can start. And I don't have a ton for any of this, but let me know what you have. So in tennis, Wimbledon was won by a guy named Fred Perry. The women's Wimbledon was won by Helen Jacobs. I thought this was interesting that Wimbledon, this was the only Wimbledon held while, what was his name? The king before the
Edward VIII.
Yeah. While he was king. US Open, Fred Perry won again. Alice Marble won the women's US Open. The French Open was won by Gottfried von Kraum from Germany.
I'll get to him in a minute.
And Hilda Sperling. And then the Australian, it seems like it was still only Australian. So I didn't really write anything down on that.
Yeah.
Because I don't think it was a major as of then.
Yeah, the big thing I had in tennis was that, two things. First of all, Don Budge, who did not win any singles majors in 1936, but was around and competitive, and would later go on. By a couple years later, he's participating in all of these international tournaments. In fact, he wins the Grand Slam in 38. He wins all four. He also wins Wimbledon and the US Open in 37. And then he wins doubles at Wimbledon. The only thing he wins in 36 is the men's doubles in the at the US Open. But then he would go on in 37. He wins the men's singles at Wimbledon and the US Open. He wins the men's doubles at Wimbledon. And then he wins the mixed doubles at Wimbledon and the US Open. And then in 38, he basically sweeps it all. Wins the men's and the mixed doubles at both Wimbledon and the US Open. He wins the doubles at the, I don't know what this SF means, but he competes in the doubles at the Australian. And then he wins all four majors in 38 and the men's singles. So the beginning of the career of one of the great tennis players of all time, Don Budge. I was curious a little bit about this guy, this Gottfried von Graham that you mentioned, because it's always kind of jarring when you look at the tennis results from this time period, because you almost kind of take it for granted that, all of these, when they show these results, that they have, the little flag for the country next to the guy. And then you look, it's like, oh, well, that's a Nazi flag. So even though he is listed under the Nazi flag, I don't know how much of a fan of the regime he was. In fact, he was later jailed by the Nazi regime for his homosexuality. So maybe not somebody who was a big supporter of the party, but did compete as a quote unquote representative of the Nazi Germany for a couple of years at least.
And as much as two things. One, this is weird to say, we're going to talk a lot more about the Nazis in a little while. And two, the way you could tell right away that he's probably not going to be really in the league with that regime is just by reading his last name, von Kram. Basically, von is a symbol of like German nobility.
Yeah, that's a good point too.
Because Hitler used to always rant about the Vons. So you had a feeling that would be, that would be the case would be that he was more of a old world German nobility kind of guy. So, but you're right. You just all of a sudden you come across that and it's like, geez. But, did you have anything else on tennis?
Nope. I'll leave it to you to where we go next.
I was just going to go to golf next.
Yeah, let's go to golf. Yeah.
So golf, the Masters, it's only the third ever Masters. It's won by Horton Smith. The U.S. Open is won by Tony Monero, British by Alf Hadguy, and then the PGA by Denny Shute. Though that, what I had.
Yeah, so I just looking real quick, the U.S. Open, both Tony Monero and Alf. Let me pull this up because I can't read my own writing. Yeah, so both Tony Monero and Alf Podgam, those are the only majors that either one of them wins. And then for the Masters, you had Horton Smith, and I don't know if that was his only career major. No, he actually won the first and the third. So Horton Smith was the winner of the first ever Masters in 34, and then he comes back to win it again in 1936. Those are his only ever two major championships. And I believe that, and I thought I had something else here. Yeah, Gene Sarazen, who had won the second, who's known as sort of one of the great golfers, maybe not the top tier, but a guy you hear about a lot. Gene Sarazen, Horton Smith had won it in 34, Sarazen won it in 35, and then Horton Smith came back again and won it in 36. And then for the PGA, Denny Shute would win again the following year in 1937. You know who the next guy is to win back-to-back PGA championships?
Is it Nicklaus?
Nope. Tiger.
Oh, wow.
So, whatever, I don't know exactly, probably, 65 or so years until that's done again.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely quite a while if that's how long it was. Did you have anything else on golf?
No, that was it for golf. An interesting year. It's the fact that it's the second and final Masters championship for the guy who won the first ever is probably the most noteworthy thing.
So horse racing, the Kentucky Derby and this is almost a modern thing. The Kentucky Derby and the Preakness were won by the same horse named Bold Venture. And there had been a Triple Crown winner the year before, Omaha. And there was a Triple Crown winner the next year in War Admiral, who that's obviously a name that people are familiar with as a Triple Crown winning horse. He bowed a tendon and did not run in the Belmont. And as soon as I heard that, I was like, okay, that was the end of that horse's life. They actually didn't. That's apparently one of the things that a horse can live with, just not race. So he did not run in the Belmont. The Belmont was won by a horse named Granville. So if not for that bowed tendon, we could have had Triple Crown winners 3 years in a row, potentially. But that was sort of it was the year of Bold Venture until he was injured and could not run in the Belmont.
Gotcha.
And then in auto racing, we're still too early for the Daytona 500 wasn't run yet. Stock car racing really wasn't a thing, or not in a way that was considered a sport or an organized sport. The Indy 500 was the 24th Indianapolis 500, Saturday, May 30th, 1936. We were still once again in the mandatory riding mechanic era. So the race was won by a guy named Lewis Meyer, and his riding mechanic was Lawson Harris. And I believe Lawson Harris was the right. He'd won another. It was his second win as a riding mechanic.
Second with Meyer. He had won it with Meyer 3 years earlier in 33.
And it looks like Meyer had also won in 1928 at least. So he won at least 3 in 500s. I guess that would happen.
That's all he wins, and he's the first one ever to win 3 Indies.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Couple of interesting traditions started.
I saw this too.
1936 Indy 500. Lewis Meyer wins, and he celebrates at Victory Lane with a bottle of buttermilk, which later started the famous tradition of serving milk in every Victory Lane in Indianapolis. It was also the first year that the Borg Warner Trophy debuted in 1936. And that is, I got to admit, that trophy, the Indy 500 trophy with all the guys' faces jutting out on it, is an incredibly unique trophy. And then this I actually didn't know about. I watch the Indy 500 every year, but pace car driver Tommy Milton suggested that the race winner should be awarded the official pace car as part of the prizes. Lewis Meyer was given the keys to the Packard after the race, and it has been a tradition ever since, with only a handful of exceptions. And sadly, it did not list when and why those exceptions were. But so 3 pretty big traditions, including the milk and the trophy, are 2 huge ones.
And apparently he actually used the pace car to drive and get around because it was later totaled in Los Angeles.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
That is interesting. And nowadays it's like a Ferrari or like some like crazy souped up, like, not compared, can't go 250 miles an hour like the race cars can, but comparatively. That leaves me with one more thing.
Yes, it does.
All right. So professional wrestling, when you talk professional wrestling in the 30s, and you ought to often, you're generally talking about Jim Londos. Jim Londos still might be the biggest draw in wrestling history. It's hard to quantify, but he still might be, considered. I got into an argument with a friend of mine years ago when I was visiting him in Portland, and he was trying to talk to me about wrestling, and you could tell he thought I was gonna like argue with him about like Stone Cold Steve Austin versus whatever. He's like, "Who do you think the biggest wrestler of all time was?" I was like, "Jim Londos in the 30s," and he just gave me a look like, "You schmuck!" Like now, what am I going to argue with you about this? But the thing with Londos in 36 and 37, Londos is basically gone. He's in Greece and other parts of Europe. He's wrestling very part-time, entirely in Europe with 1 or 2 exceptions. So, it's kind of a gap in that era in the 30s. There is something very interesting that happens, and we're in the National Wrestling Alliance wouldn't be founded until 47. So you're in the era of kind of competing guys with different claims to the heavyweight championship. Dano O'Mahony enters 1936 as the undefeated champion. In March of 36, he wrestles Dick Schickat, who's another name that, in professional wrestling from that era, that's a well-known name for people who, know wrestling from that era. And as happened a lot back then, Dick Schickat, probably at the prompting of his promoters, went into business for himself, shall we say, and got Dano O'Mahony in a hold, and basically told the ref, "You better ring the bell or I'm going to break his arm." And the ref rang the bell, and the AWA continued to recognize Mahoney as the champion. Dick Schickat got recognized by the people who wanted to recognize Dick Schickat as the champion, and the heavyweight title was refractured again another little while. And these were the problems that ultimately the National Wrestling Alliance was founded to solve. But that was kind of the big story from wrestling in 1936, was the Schickat O'Mahony shoot. I believe they blew it off in a ladder match in 37. But
all I can think of is, and I don't know which pay-per-view this was, but it only could be a handful of them. When Ventura was trying to give Monsoon a hard time about how old he was or something, he goes, "I remember you having that big fight with Londos in 37.
I think that might have been WrestleMania 3. Because I think Monsoon last like, "I wasn't even born in
37. I wasn't even born."
But yeah, so that was very much the era. The 20s and 30s were the era of guys, and that's why for the long time, even going into the 70s in the NWA, the champion was almost always a guy who had some legitimate wrestling ability. And it wasn't
because they wanted him to be able to protect himself if somebody tried to.
Yeah, it wasn't just because they felt like it gave it legitimacy if they could say he was an Olympic champion or a former NCAA champion. That was part of it. But another big part of it was he could at the very least get out of something if somebody was trying to go into business for themselves and at least, not visibly get their arm broken or have to give up in the ring. So it was a long time before anybody who wasn't like a legitimate NCAA or better level wrestler was actually given the world championship.
All right. So we got boxing, we got football, and we got the Olympics left. I'm going to say let's go to boxing next, if that's cool with you.
I agree.
And it's funny because there's not really a lot here. I mean, there is, but there isn't. And one of the things that's interesting to me is there was no heavyweight title fight in 36. And if you look at years around that, there were there were years when there were 10 heavyweight title fights, and there was not a single one in 36.
Yeah, James Braddock had won the heavyweight championship in June of 1935 and then did not fight again until June of 1937. And I've tried to find what the reason for that is, and I didn't find anything necessarily, satisfactory about that. And Braddock, for people, and God, this movie's 20 years ago now, but there was a movie called Cinderella Man, which is based on James Braddock, who'd been kind of a journeyman fighter and ends up beating Max Baer for the title in June of 35. They really did not treat Max Baer very accurately in that movie. He wins the title.
It's still a classic.
What, the
Cinderella Man? It's still a classic.
Who said that? Mad Dog?
No, it's when in The Sopranos, when AJ gets fired from Blockbuster and Carmela goes, I was at Blockbuster trying to rent Cinderella Man today, and you know what I found out? And Tony goes, it's still a classic. And it was actually that AJ had gotten fired. Anyway, go ahead.
Does not fight again until 37 at Comiskey Park when he loses to Joe Louis, and then actually only fights one more time, and his career is over. So you're right. No heavyweight title fight at all. Certainly not one of any profile. No, not one at all in 1936. I didn't see too much like otherwise in lower weight divisions or anything. Did you?
Not really, although there is one thing that I want to look up. But yeah, the way for those who don't know, the Cinderella Man movie was based on a Cinderella Man book by Jeremy Schaap. And it's funny, actually, because Jeremy Schaap has written two really good books, both that really factor into this time period that we're talking about tonight, because he wrote Cinderella Man, and then he also wrote a book called I think it was called Victory. It was about Jesse Owens' 1936 Olympics. So two really good Jeremy Schaap books. And it just seems like Braddock was one of these, maybe he didn't really expect to win. And so he was just sort of like, they were trying to figure out when they were going to fight. I think they were trying to figure out who he was going to fight, and Max Baer gets impatient, and so then he goes and fights Joe Louis later in 35, and then he loses to Louis, and so then it's a question of like, okay, so who's he going to fight now? Now the thought is he's going to fight Louis instead of Braddock. So yeah, I didn't see any real sort of specifics as to what the reason was, and then as we'll probably talk about in a minute here, Louis is going to fight Schmeling in 36, and then Schmeling was a former champion. Schmeling had actually taken and then lost the title back to Jack Sharkey earlier in the 30s. So I think the thought is probably that maybe he wants to fight Schmeling next. If Schmeling wins, that's probably who he wants to fight, although he ends up not fighting Schmeling, even though Schmeling wins. So there's a lot going on here. But from what I was able to tell, it seems like the issue was just that they couldn't get the fight organized until 37.
Yeah, there's a real good reason to fight Schmeling. But so the fight that you have to talk about when you talk about boxing in 1936 is Joe Louis against Max Schmeling, the first fight. This was June 19th, 1936 at Yankee Stadium. Joe Louis was 22 years old. He was 24-0 with 21 knockouts. He was knocking on the door of fighting for the heavyweight championship. And Joe Louis himself had to overcome the fact that they weren't real hot to give a black guy the shot at the heavyweight championship. There hadn't been a black heavyweight champion since Jack Johnson. And there's a movie called Joe and Max, which is not super. I mean, it's okay. It's like a Showtime movie from 20 years ago. But as he's going in to fight for the title, which isn't this fight, it's later, his trainer says to him, he says, just so you know, champ, you can't win by decision tonight. White folks still haven't forgot Jack Johnson running around with his white women like he was king shit. And it's a phrase I always think of. So like Louis is coming up through that. And he's also not a fully experienced, fully rounded boxer yet, as we're going to talk about in a minute. Max Schmeling is 30 years old. He's got 7 losses. He's 48, 7, and 4. He'd previously been the heavyweight champion and I think lost pretty quickly.
Yeah, that's what I was saying a minute ago. He beat Sharkey and then lost it back to Jack Sharkey.
Yeah, so he won the title in June of 30, so 6 full years before this. Had one title defense against a guy named Young Sterling in Cleveland, and then lost it back to Sharkey in June of 32. And it been, going around since then, actually not doing that well. He lost to Max Baer. Had strung together a few wins, mostly back in Germany, when he comes into this fight against Louis. And Louis is sort of the classic example at this point of a guy. He's 24-0 with 21 knockouts. He has not fought a lot of deep fights. His condition is not great. And I watched this fight. And some of the rounds have the radio overlaid on it and some of them don't, but I watched it as closely as I could. But basically the story of the fight, the actual fight, the story is as Max Schmeling, and this has got to be one of the earliest examples of this, as Max Schmeling is studying film of Joe Louis's fights, he notices something. And he actually says to the press, he says, I noticed something. But he didn't say what it was, but he says, I see so. I think the quote is he said, I see something. And what he sees is that when Joe Louis jabs with his left hand, when he brings his jab back, when he brings his left arm back, he brings it back really low, like to his waist level. He's creating a wide open chance every time Louis jabs. Schmeling hits him with a right cross and just drills him. And gradually, as the fight goes on, he knocks Louis down in the 4th round for the first time in his career. Louis is clearly tired. He's rattled. And Schmeling is just wearing him out. He's winning almost every round. And by the 12th round, which is the final round, because it's not a championship fight, I couldn't find the actual scorecards, but I just see everybody say Schmeling was way ahead. He knocks Louis down, and this is a very different era. He knocks him down. Louis gets right up. He knocks him down again. There's no break. He doesn't go back.
Standing 8 count. Yeah.
Yeah. And Louis goes down enough times where it's a knockout, and Max Schmeling defeats Joe Louis by decision or by knockout. As a boxing match, it's a big upset for a guy who seemed like he was on the downside of his career. Given what we're talking about, it obviously became a big world event. Max Schmeling is German. He's, up until that point, not said or done anything overtly political, but he hasn't said or done anything to really distance himself from, Nazi Germany, from Adolf Hitler. And it's 1936. And look, if you look at what Adolf Hitler said and did up until 1936, yes, it's obviously appalling and evil, but it's not 1943, 1944, 1945. I think just being loyal to his country at that point was enough to brand him as a as a Nazi figure.
Well, and from what I read, he did say Heil Hitler after the fight. He said, like, I hope Hitler's watching, Heil Hitler, or something like that.
I have the quote. And I mean, I guess one of the fights, like a few fights before that, he's like in the ring and they're doing the salute after the fight. He said, at this moment, I have to tell Germany, I have to report to the Fuhrer in particular that the thoughts of all my countrymen were with me in this fight, that the Fuhrer and his faithful people were thinking of me. This thought gave me strength to succeed in the fight. It gave me the courage and the endurance to win this victory for Germany's colors. Max Schmeling does not get a shot at the heavyweight title because, and probably correctly, the fear is that if he fights James Braddock and wins the championship, he's not going to fight another non-German. He's going to go back to Germany and basically only fight guys in Germany. And, I know there were sanctioning bodies back then that could have stripped him the title, but it wasn't, that was the fear. And that was the big reason that Max Schmeling did not get a shot at the title.
Now, I wonder what changed that a couple of years later, and Lewis fights Schmeling.
Joe Louis wanted to fight him.
Oh, there you go.
Joe Louis did not feel like... So basically what happens is Joe Louis then goes on. Joe Louis, even though he was defeated soundly, gets the shot at the heavyweight title. Joe Louis wins the heavyweight title, goes on, defends it against Max Schmeling, and beats Max Schmeling in 45 seconds in a fight that by that point had taken on a mythical proportion in terms of cultural, political significance in both this country and in Germany. As happened with a lot of athletes, unfortunately, Max Schmeling and his story was co-opted by the German government, the Nazi government. He became a figurehead. He was branded in the rest of the world as a Nazi. So he went on. I'm trying to see when so Lewis fights Sharkey next. Then he fights a few more fights. He finally gets his shot at the title in June of 37 over Braddock. He beats Braddock. He defends the title a few more times. And then in June of 38, almost 2 years to the day, he fights Schmeling and just destroys him in 2 minutes and retains the heavyweight champion and avenges his only loss until he loses to Ezra Charles in 1950. Max Schmeling would go on to, he was never fully comfortable with the German, with the Nazi regime. He would rustle the Germans and maybe even Hitler directly basically told him, you need to fire your manager, Joe Jacobs, who was a Jew. He basically said, no, I'm only going to, he gets the opportunities. Jacobs is the one who gets me the fights, can get me a shot at the title. Jacobs was around this time suspended for an unrelated thing that was some sort of like minor corruption thing or something with a fighter that wasn't supposed to be licensed or something like that. So that led to him not technically being Schmeling's manager for this fight, which led a lot of people to say, oh, he fired his Jewish manager or whatever, but it really wasn't that. It should also be pointed out that Max Schmeling hit a few people in his hotel room during Kristallnacht. He did get drafted into the German army where he got shot in the knee. Max Schmeling wasn't a Nazi. Max Schmeling wasn't a member of the high command. He was a guy who was from his country, got drafted into the army, got drafted politically into, even to the extent of during this fight, he noticed something Joe Louis did. They basically tried to shape that into Max Schmeling noticed a genetic defect with the Negro, and that's how he was able to exploit him in a fight. And really, it was that he noticed he dropped his left hand. The other thing, and there's going to be more of this when we talk about the Olympics, by the way, this country treated Joe Louis horribly. Joe Louis was impoverished. He was mentally ill. We made him, we did not treat Joe Louis very well. this country had a very vested interest in Joe Louis for the minute and a half he was in the ring with Max Schmeling in 1938, winning, and then went back to not having much use for him. So, it's an interesting story. It's certainly a boxing story. The fairy tale that a lot of Americans like to tell about this, and again, there's going to be more of this in a few minutes, is wildly inaccurate, and it's unfair to both Joe Louis and Max Schmeling.
Before we leave boxing, speaking of the sort of black boxers of the day, I just want to mention this was the prime of a guy named Henry Armstrong, who was known as Homicide Henry or Homicide Hank Armstrong. He was felt a featherweight, a lightweight, and a welterweight. He held all three championships at once at a certain point, and I don't have anything particularly noteworthy he did other than he fights a number of times in 1936. Many people consider him to be perhaps pound for pound the greatest boxer of all time. Burt Randolph Sugar says that Armstrong is the second greatest fighter of all time. Teddy Atlas considers Armstrong to be the greatest of all time. The Ring magazine ranked him as the best fighter of basically the 80 years from 1927 to 2007. He was Sporting News called him the fighter of the decade for the entire 1930s. I don't know a lot about the guy, but Homicide Henry Armstrong is somebody we also should mention.
All right. Should we talk about the Olympics now?
Yeah, let's move on to the Olympics. And I didn't have a ton of things that I wanted to highlight, some of the obvious, but why don't you kick us off and then we'll take it from there. I basically have things that I want to talk about: basketball, track and field, obviously, and then rowing were the three big things I wanted to hit.
The one thing to mention, there was a Winter Olympics.
Yeah, I was just about to say that. I think it was like the fourth Winter Olympics.
In February of 1936 in Garmisch-Partenkirchen, Germany. Sorry if I butchered there's a chance my family's from there, but I'm sorry if I butchered the pronunciation of that. I did see in the Wikipedia entry, it said winter sports were only accepted by the Nazi Party because Italian dictator Mussolini promoted skiing.
I saw that too.
So yeah, I don't have much on the Winter Olympics. Like you mentioned, it's one of the first few Olympics. Obviously, everybody talks about the Berlin Olympics in the summer, which we're going to talk about. Ice hockey, Rudy Ball, who was a Jew, was allowed to play on the German ice hockey team because, it's still sort of the sports washing and the hiding of the true aspects of a lot of the Nazi regime they were still at the phase where they knew they had to cover a lot of these things up to a Western, a wider worldwide audience. So just figured I would mention that, but that's really all I had on the winter before we get into the summer.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is that it's worth noting from a geopolitical point of view, these Olympic Games, as they are now and as they were then, were actually awarded 5 years earlier. So there was actually not Hitler and the Nazis in power yet. It was still the Weimar Republic that received it in 1931. But, from the point of view of and there was also, and I didn't necessarily realize this, and, obviously we don't want to go down too much of a rabbit hole. There was talk of not competing, of the U.S. not competing, of the IOC taking the games away. Nothing came of it, but it's not as if nobody raised any sort of questioning or objection.
And there was a counter Olympics planned called the People's Olympiad to be held in Barcelona, Spain. And it got pretty far down the line of happening, but then the Spanish Civil War broke out and they were not able to hold the People's Olympiad. So I just figured I would mention that. Mm-hmm. This is the first Olympics with a torch relay.
I saw that.
From Greece to Berlin. It was filmed and made into a movie by Leni Riefenstahl. But this was, this is something that still exists to this day, the torch relay of carrying the Olympic flame from the home of the Olympics in Greece to the ancestral home to the Olympic site.
So maybe let's start with basketball, because that's probably the one that's more just fun as opposed to and I had a hard time figuring some of this out, because the first thing I saw was that it looked like it was teams that competed and we'll touch on this again when we get to rowing. Teams competed to qualify rather than individual players the way you'd think of it. And it was the Universal Pictures team with a bunch of guys, mostly from UCLA, but then also from USC, who made it on. But then as I'm looking at this, it looks like there were a number of players, and I could probably read more about this, but to try and find out more. But here we go. There was, so Needles, Jimmy Needles, who was the coach of the team, was trying to get around some rules. Teams were limited to rosters of 7 players. All games were played outdoors on a surface which was a mixture of sand and clay, which had been a tennis court. Needles protests the stipulation that players had to be 6'2" or shorter. There were only 2 teams per game. 2 subs per team per game, and you could only have, like we said, 7 teams. So Needles essentially splits the team into 2 different rosters. They play 4 games. Their first game against Spain is a forfeit, and then they beat in succession Estonia, the Philippines, Mexico, and Canada, including in the gold medal game. It's the U.S. and Canada in a downpour, and the U.S. escapes with a 19-8 victory. This is also the first Olympics, or maybe the first basketball Olympic event ever, where Chuck Taylors are worn. The U.S. wears Chuck Taylors in the Olympics. The aforementioned Long Island Blackbirds of Claire B, made up heavily of Jewish players, boycott the Olympics, so one of the best teams doesn't participate. There's no timeouts, only 1 ref, very few violations. Basketball had been a demonstration sport in 1904, but this is the first time it's played for a medal, and the U.S. basketball team wins the gold medal game against Canada 19-8. The only other thing I have is that the Canada wins the silver, Mexico wins the bronze, and to date, those are still the only 2 medals for those 2 teams in men's Olympic basketball.
Yeah, it's definitely a sort of proximity to the U.S. is kind of what decides how good you are at basketball at this point.
So the other thing I wanted to touch on was rowing. And I don't know a lot about this either, but this is the 1930 men's rowing team, which the U.S. wins by less than a second. It is made up of rowers from the University of Washington, and you talk about movies and best-selling books. This team was the inspiration for the famed book, and I believe subsequently a movie called The Boys in the Boat, which was an award-winning book. So if you're ever curious about The Boys in the Boat, the book, the movie, it comes from this 1936 men's Olympic rowing team from the University of Washington.
And a lot of that movie, as the championships did, takes place in
Poughkeepsie, right?
Right on the banks of the Hudson River. Where the world championships were held. And on the walkway over the Hudson, they always had the signs up about how for years the NCAA championships were held right here. And then when they made that movie and somebody said, a lot of that movie's in Poughkeepsie, I was like, oh yeah, that's why. Because the NCAA title championships used to be held in on the Hudson River in Poughkeepsie.
So the main event is the men's track and field. But I want to get real quick to something with the women's track and field. A woman by the name of Betty Robinson, who in 1928 in Amsterdam had won the 100 meters for the women. She was the first winner of the first Olympic 100 meters for women. She missed the 1932 Olympic Games because on June, and this is only funny because it ended up working out. On June of 1931, she was involved in a plane crash and was severely injured. The guy who finds her thinks she's dead, and so the infirmary he takes her to is a place where he only goes there because he knows the Undertaker, and he thinks this woman's going to need to be buried. Turns out she's not dead. It's like that joke from The Simpsons. He was pronounced dead, and he was soon upgraded to alive. She misses the 32 Olympics. She's told she's never race again, but she recovers, even though she's unable to kneel. She's a part of the team for the 4x100 meter relay, the women's at the 36 Olympics. The U.S. team is running far behind the heavily favored Germans, but the Germans drop their baton. Robinson takes the lead, hands it off to her teammate, and the U.S. women's 4x100 team wins the gold medal in not only a miraculous upset of the Germans, but also an incredible comeback for Miss Betty Robinson.
So before we get to track, I did want to mention in the opening ceremonies, the Hindenburg flew over the opening ceremonies. I didn't realize that. I don't remember which year the Hindenburg crashed.
I think it was like 38. Yeah.
Something. So, obviously the track and fields, Jesse Owens is when people say 1936 Olympics, the thing they talk about when they talk about achievements is Jesse Owens.
He wins 4 gold medals. He wins the 100 meters, the 200 meters, the 4x100, and the long jump. You know who finishes second to him in the 200 meters?
Who's that?
A guy by the name of Mac Robinson, who is a track star at UCLA.
Oh, I did know this, yeah.
But he is probably not nearly as well known as his brother, who is also a track star, as well as a football and a basketball and a baseball star at UCLA, Jackie Robinson.
Yes, that is right. I do remember that, yeah. Let's talk about being a footnote in history in a couple of ways.
Exactly. So, yes. I mean, we're not track and field experts by any means, but maybe we should just run through sort of what Owens does, because this is also the only Olympics that Jesse Owens ever competes in. You see these guys later, and and part of that's probably because there's not another Olympics for 12 years, but even so, it's it's a one-shot deal for him.
Yeah, Owens wins the 100 meters, the 200 meters, the long jump, and the 4x100 relay, which he's a late addition to.
Yeah, that's a very interesting story. In that, and let me pull this up here because I want to get it right. The head coach replaces 2 Jewish American sprinters, Marty Glickman and Sam Stoller, with Owens and Ralph Metcalf, and then they combine with 2 white American sprinters to set a world record as 39.8 seconds. Owens protests originally, but then he's basically told, you're going to do what you're told. The rumor was always that they had replaced these 2 Jewish sprinters to avoid embarrassing Hitler further. I think that's sort of been debunked or at least questioned through the years, partially because people ask, I guess, again, this is disgusting to talk about this way, but did Hitler really prefer black athletes to Jewish athletes? Who knows, right? But I don't know if there's actually any truth to the fact that the replacement was done, but nonetheless, what it does do is it enables Jesse Owens to win his fourth gold medal. And it's the, putting beyond everything else, it's the greatest Olympic performance to date by any athlete, probably as of 1936.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and to win it too in like 3 different, like the long jump is a totally different thing.
Yeah.
And I mean, I know it's almost 100 years ago, so it's a different, like the people who do sprinting don't also do the long jump, to the best of my knowledge at this point.
No, you see guys who do it in decathlon, but they're not Olympic competitors in both.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, you're right. Just a dominant performance. The famous thing is that Hitler was so upset he wouldn't shake Jesse Owens' hand. That's another thing that's been sort of debunked. Which is
apparently he had stopped doing that for anybody at a certain point.
Yeah, and it's like you don't like to tell that part of the story because it sounds like you're being like, "Hey, give Hitler a break here," and that's not. But again, and I won't make the same speech I just made, but like, Jesse Owens stuck it to the Nazis and then came home and couldn't get a job and wasn't allowed to ride on a bus in the South and all of that. So like again, let's honor his Olympic contributions and. You can acknowledge the world history and the 1936 Olympics as a world event, the insane backdrop that it was, without using Jesse Owens' actual real life as a fairy tale to make everybody feel good about, to make everybody feel good.
And then I guess we should just mention that one of the guys who maybe would otherwise be a footnote in history as one of the two sprinters who were replaced by Owens and the other sprinter was Marty Glickman, who then goes on to a long career in sports broadcasting, and at a certain point he does games for the Knicks, the Giants, the Rangers, the Nets, the Brooklyn Dodgers, I think the Jets. I think I saw the Jets in here somewhere. Let me just check in on that. He did Jets games too. Yonkers Raceway, he was the voice of. He did high school football in New York. He later did UConn basketball and football. He did Ivy League games. It says here he did Ivy League football games for PBS. I don't know if that's just a mistype or something. I don't know if they actually.
That wouldn't shock me.
That wouldn't shock me. He covered, in 1988, he returned to TV as a play-by-play replacement while Marv Albert was in Seoul covering the Olympics. So again, this is another one of those things where it was like, even if this guy hadn't been a teammate of Jesse Owens on the 36 Olympics, this is a guy who did play-by-play for like 7 different New York teams in 4 different sports. So he's worth noting just for that, let alone the other stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, obviously a world, famous Olympics and, just the visuals of it. If you can look at the 1936 Olympics from a lot of different ways, but we wanted to at least, ostensibly cover it as a sporting event. And, obviously the place where rain basketball took off and is still the most popular sport in the world.
So I think we want to close with football. This is the first, but let's just do college football real quick. Maybe if that's cool with you.
Yeah, that's fine.
This is the first year with an Associated Press champion. It's the first year of the Cotton Bowl. The 2 teams that I saw that really had a claim to the national title were Minnesota and Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is coached by the legendary Jock Sutherland, who's a Hall of Fame college football coach, and they won a number of national championships or retroactive national championships in this time period in the 30s. And then the only other thing I had was that Larry Kelly of Yale is an end who wins the second ever Heisman Trophy, but it's the first year that it is considered the Heisman Trophy because a guy by the name of John Heisman, who it's named after, passed away prior to the 1936 season. So this was the first year that it was named after John Heisman. And if you just give me a second, it's probably only right that we give you a little bit of background about just exactly who John Heisman was. He was a player in the Ivy League for both Brown and Penn in the 19th century, and then he ended up coaching any number of teams, but it was most prominent with Georgia Tech. Won a national championship with Georgia Tech in 1917. Also coached basketball and baseball at Georgia Tech around the same time. So he is the namesake of the Heisman Trophy. He passes away in October of 36. So when they give the award at the end of the 36 season, it's become named after him.
Yeah, and Larry Kelly, the one who won it, leads a very interesting and not entirely, happy life. He ends up committing suicide late in life. He sold his Heisman Trophy. You know where that ended up?
I do not.
It ended up at the Stadium restaurant in Garrison, New York.
Oh, I know there was a Heisman Trophy there. I didn't know that's who it was.
Yep. He ultimately ended up selling his Heisman Trophy shortly before he ended up committing suicide. But I don't know where it is now.
Yeah, that place went out of business, right?
Yeah, years ago, maybe 15 years ago. It was around when I first moved back to New York in 2010, because I remember going there a couple of times, but it's been gone well over a decade at this point.
So yeah, I think that's pretty much it for college football. Yeah, the AP, it's and again, I'm looking at just a Wikipedia here, but it's unclear exactly. It looks like Minnesota and Pittsburgh both have a claim to the title, but the well-known team is really this Jock Sutherland coached Pittsburgh Panthers team. Sutherland would go on to win 6 national championships, the first one in 21, the last one in 1937, and then actually coaches a few years in the NFL in the 40s. He's a legendary coach in Pittsburgh lore, and this is they win the Rose Bowl, and they have at least a claim to the national championship in 1936.
And Navy beat Army 7-0 in Philadelphia.
All right, so I think we probably want to close with professional football in the NFL in 1936. Although way back when we did our episode on the rival leagues, competitive and rival leagues, and 1936 was the first year of the American Football League. This is now the second American Football League. The first one was the one that was founded by Red Grange. The third one was, I think, for a year in the 40s that nobody took seriously. And then the fourth one was the one in the 60s. The American Football League was around for 2 years. It featured the Boston Shamrocks, the Brooklyn Tigers, Cleveland Rams, New York Yankees, Pittsburgh Americans, Syracuse Braves, Cincinnati Bengals, and Los Angeles Bulldogs. And I believe, is this the Los Angeles Bulldogs did not lose or tie a game in its one season in the AFL. And is this the team that didn't play any games on the West Coast? No, I think that was a different LA team in a different rival league. So anyway, there is a rival league to the NFL in the 1936 and 1937, perhaps best known as where the Cleveland Rams first came into being, and they later became the LA Rams, and then the St. Louis Rams, and then the LA Rams. So it is the birthplace of one current day NFL team.
So the 1936 NFL season, there are is the first year of the NFL draft. So that was interesting. The first pick was a guy named Jay Berwanger, who never signed or played in the NFL, but it was the first year of the NFL draft, which is now this huge event. And actually next week is the beginning of it. You had 9 teams in the NFL, many of whom still, I think 8 of the 9 still exist in some form today. In the Eastern Division, you had the Boston Redskins, Pittsburgh Pirates, New York Giants, Brooklyn Dodgers, and Philadelphia Eagles. And then in the Western Division, you had the Green Bay Packers, Chicago Bears, Detroit Lions, and Chicago Cardinals were your 9 teams.
Before we get into the postseason, a writer who is Chris Willis, who's a historian. He works for NFL Films, and he's this historian of the early NFL. And he came out with a book a couple years ago where he rewards a retroactive MVP to every year of what he calls the Iron Man era, the two-way era of 1920 to 1945. His retroactive MVP for 1936 is Dutch Clark of the Detroit Lions. We talked about him a little bit when we talked about the 1932 NFL title game in Chicago Stadium, but Dutch Clark, who leads the league with 7 touchdowns in 1936, and remember, stats are incomplete, but he's an All-Pro. He's an AP All-Pro for the 5th time in his career. He's an AP All-Pro for the first 6 of his 7 years in the NFL. So Dutch Clark, maybe the greatest player of the two-way era in general, but definitely the best player of the two-way era in 1936. And he is the retroactive MVP of the 1936 season. But his Lions do not make it into the NFL title game. That is 2 other teams, the Green Bay Packers and the Boston Redskins.
This is also the first year that no team either folds or is added in the 11-year history of the NFL. So a little bit of stability there. And it's all the league teams played the same number of games, 12. So again,
this is the first time for that?
Yeah, according to this, yeah, I just real quick went to 1935, and it looked very close. The only teams that didn't play 12 games were the Redskins and Eagles, both only played 11 games. So I'm wondering if at like the end of the year they just didn't play a game that they needed to.
Bagged it, yeah.
Yeah, because they were both like bad teams or whatever. But so we're starting to notice the stabilizing, the crystallizing of an actual professional league. You mentioned the Packers and the Redskins, just the leaders in some of these. Arnie Herber from Green Bay was the leading passer. Ed Matisic from the Pirates was number 2. Tuffy Leemans from the Giants led the NFL in rushing by just 3 yards with 830. Don Hudson, leading receiver, 536. Also the leading touchdown with 9 touchdowns.
And this Hall of Fame connection of Herber to Hudson is a really big deal in 36. Herber is the first to officially throw for more than 1,000 yards, and that's in 1936. And then Hudson sets records with 34 catches and 534 yards, both single-season records that are set in 1936.
On December 6th, the Redskins and the Giants played for, I believe, the last regular season game of the year, with the division somewhat hanging in the balance, although the Pittsburgh Pirates were involved as well. The Redskins won, so they clinched and were able to host the NFL championship game. George Preston Marshall actually opted that rather than play the game in Boston, they would play the game at the Polo Grounds where they had just played and won. And there were just under 30,000 people there to watch the championship game.
He's disgusted by the fact that he's getting no support in Boston.
And as you know, as good indication of that, by the time the year was over, they would be officially moving to the nation's capital to become the Washington Redskins.
Yeah, we did an episode just a couple episodes ago about the greatest NFL championship games of the pre-Super Bowl era. This 36 game does not really make the list. It doesn't even really get considered. It's a Packer blowout. Herbert throws 2 touchdowns, including a 48-yarder to Don Hudson to get the Packers on the board in the first quarter. This is the 4th official championship game, and they'd been won previously by the Bears. The 34 was the Giants, the Lions, and this is the first one that the Packers win. They had won 3 titles in a row from 29 to 31, but this is their first ever championship win, coached by the legendary Curly Lambeau with the legendary Don Hudson at end wide receiver, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, so like you mentioned, this is not one of the classic early championship games, and there were some good ones. It's not like a bias from modern bias or whatever. Yeah, this is several days after the game Marshall announced they were moving, so it was very quick. But it was the Packers were ahead 7-0 on a 48-yard pass from Herbert to Hudson. The Redskins made it a 7-6 game in the second quarter on a touchdown from Pug Rentner. Although they missed the extra point, it's just his kick failed. So it was 7-6 at halftime. Herbert threw a touchdown to Milt Gantenbein to make it 14-6 in the third quarter. And then for good measure, the Packers scored another touchdown in the fourth quarter to make it 21-6. And that ended up being the final score.
Before we go, there's just one more thing I want to mention. There's a little bit of a theme you might notice or you might not notice as we talk about this time period. And maybe we don't need to get too into this, but this was the Red Wings won the Stanley Cup in 36. Joe Louis beat Max Schmeling in 1936. The Tigers had won the title in 34.
Max Schmeling beat Joe Louis.
Oh, you're right. Max Schmeling beat Joe Louis in 36. You're right. But then Louis went on to beat Bear in 36. Or maybe late 35. Anyway, and then the Lions and the Tigers had both recently won championships. They hosted in Detroit in April of 1936 this Dinner of Champions. It was the City of Champions testimonial featuring players from all three teams, as well as Joe Louis, as well as other sort of champions in other lesser sports, bowling, track and field, this type of thing. They called it the greatest gathering of champions under a single roof. And I'm looking at pictures here. They have everybody from Harry Kipke, who is the University of Michigan football coach. They have Joseph Carr, president of the NFL. Jack Adams, Potsy Clark, coaches of the Red Wings and Lions. Joe Louis sitting next to them. Later on, you see Eldon Auker, Cy Perkins, Mickey Cochran, who are all Tigers players. Pete Kelly, who I believe is a Detroit Red Wing. So this was an honest to God dinner with Joe Louis and other great champions of Detroit. And it was just I want to learn more about this, but it's not anything I've ever heard about being done in any other city at any other time where they got all of their great sports champions under one roof for a testimonial dinner. So I thought that was kind of a cool thing to mention on the way out.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So that's 1936 in a nutshell. It was a lot there, Olympics, football, lots of baseball, obviously, but, we hope you found this an informative 2 hours of information on 1936 in sports.
Yep, it's always a lot to get to. It's one of our more studying intensive episodes, at least for me. But it's fun to hit on all the different things.
Well, thank you for doing it with me, and thank you all for listening. And we will be back soon. But for tonight, I'm Dan Newman,
and I'm Andrew Newman. Goodbye, old sports.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com. Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, a.k.a. the Football History Dude, and I hope that you enjoyed this recent episode presented by the Sports History Network and were able to learn some good old-fashioned sports history knowledge nuggets. I started the Sports History Network back in 2020 with the mission to help podcasters find a community of like-minded sports history nerds, as well as helping aspiring podcasters to start their own shows. We have a little bit over 30 shows on the network right now covering all sorts of sports history, but as far as I'm concerned, we're just at the toothpick in the ocean moment, that can't even figure it out because there's so much more coming. We wanted to create the ultimate headquarters for sports yesteryear, starting with Podcast Network and our website, but we're going to continue to move into other mediums as well. And here's the cool part, because we want you to be part of our team. So if you're interested in starting your own podcast, or maybe being a guest on one of our shows, or who knows, maybe even writing an article for us over on the website. Seriously, all you got to do is reach out to us on the contact page over at sportshistorynetwork.com. You can be as technologically savvy as a Neanderthal tapping on a stone trying to figure out this whole hieroglyphics thing back in the day. Again, it doesn't matter, because even if you don't understand the whole podcast space, we have a production team that can pretty much help you out with doing everything. All you got to do, head over to sportshistorynetwork.com, head to the contact page, fill it out. That message goes right to me, and I'll reach out to you as soon as I can. But for now, dude, I'm through if you're through.